On a world map, there are cities with populations in the tens of millions, massive seaports with forests of towering cranes and the sound of ship horns echoing day and night. Those are the places you think of when someone mentions the arteries of global trade. But then there is a place that is not like that. A population of just 12,300 people, no skyscrapers, no boulevards, glittering with lights, just small streets, bakeries steaming in the morning, and a sky that is always damp because this is Canada's rainiest city. And yet, in 2022, over $60 billion worth of goods passed through this place. Giant container ships from Asia make landfall here before any other port in North America. Cargo leaves the ships, gets loaded onto trains, and just 4 days later, it arrives in Chicago faster than trains departing from Los Angeles or Seattle. The question is not why this place is important. The real question is, how did such a remote wilderness become one of the most important trade corridors in all of the Americas? And the answer doesn't begin in 1914, when the first railway was completed. It doesn't begin in 1903, when an ambitious man decided to build a port here. The answer begins 5,000 years ago, and it has to do with geography in a way that very few people have ever realized. This is the story of the Skeena Corridor, and of how a river shaped the destiny of an entire continent. If you look at a map of Western Canada, the first thing that strikes you isn't the big cities or the highways. The first thing you see is mountains. The Coast Mountains run along the Pacific coast in a nearly unbroken line, stretching over 1,600 kilometers from south to north. These are not small, easily conquered mountains. These are massive granite batholiths, peaks capped with year-round snow and slopes covered in a temperate rainforest so dense that sunlight barely touches the ground. To the east of that range is a vast inland plateau. To the west is the Pacific Ocean. And in between, like a giant wall, stand the Coast Mountains, leaving few gaps for anything or anyone to pass through. But it's not entirely impassable. Along the entire length of that range, only a few rivers are powerful enough to have torn through the rock and carved natural corridors connecting the coast to the interior. The Fraser River is one of them, and it laid the geographical foundation for the city of Vancouver. But the Fraser is in the south. To the north, running through the region that is now the province of British Columbia, there is another river. The Tsimshian people call it Keshin, meaning water from the clouds. Westerners later came to know it as the Skeena River. The Skeena River is 580 kilometers long, and it does something very few rivers in this region can do. It flows from the inland plateau straight to the Pacific Ocean, cutting right through the Coast Mountains and creating a valley wide enough for people, boats, and later railway lines to travel through. But there is something even more special than all of that. Where the Skeena River meets the sea, the harbour is deep. Not just deep in the ordinary sense. This is the deepest natural harbour in all of North America, with a depth of up to 35 metres. And unlike many seaports in northern Canada, this place never freezes in winter, as the Pacific currents keep the water temperature warm enough year-round. This is a combination of two factors that no planet in the world could create by human hands. A natural corridor through an impassable mountain range, and a deep water, ice-free port located right at the mouth of that corridor. But to understand why this matters, you first need to understand what lies on the other side of the mountains. The Coast Mountains are not just a physical wall, they are the boundary between two completely different worlds. To the west is the ocean, with its fish and marine resources. To the east are the deep forests, with their game animals and the raw materials of the land. Those two worlds needed each other. The coastal peoples had dried fish, fish oil, and seashells things the inland peoples did not have. The forest-dwelling peoples had wild game meat and furs things the coastal peoples did not have. Trade between these two worlds was inevitable, and the only way to conduct that trade was through the natural corridors that cut through the mountains. The Skeena River was one of the most important of these corridors. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples used the Skeena River as a primary transportation route. Dugout canoes carried people and goods upstream from the sea into the interior, and then back downstream to the coast. No form of overland travel could move faster than a boat on the river when faced with mountains and dense forests. And as trade developed, strategic locations along the river became as valuable as gold. There is a place on the Skeena River where everything changed. About 20 kilometers east of the present-day city of Terrace, the Skeena River narrows abruptly. Not a gradual narrowing for which you could prepare yourself. It narrows suddenly, squeezed between two sheer cliffs up to 30 meters high, with small rocky islands that divide the river into 4 separate channels, creating treacherous whirlpools that can capsize a boat in an instant. This is Kitselas Canyon. For thousands of years, anyone wishing to pass through this section of the river had to do one of two things: either be skilled and courageous enough to paddle through those dangerous whirlpools, or stop and negotiate with the people who controlled the canyon, and the people who controlled the canyon were the Kitselas. The Kitselas, a branch of the Tsimshian people, have inhabited Kitselas Canyon for at least 5,000 years. Archaeological evidence indicates there were once as many as 6 villages here, with a population that may have reached hundreds living in wooden longhouses. But what is truly interesting is not that they lived here. What is interesting is how they lived here. Kitselas Canyon is one of the most perfect examples of economic power created by geography. The Kitselas did not need a large army. They did not need sophisticated weapons. All they needed was control over that geographical bottleneck on the Skeena River, and they became the customs agents of the ancient world. Anyone who wanted to pass had to pay a toll. Traders from the coast brought up dried salmon, herring roe, and eulachon oil. Traders from the interior brought down venison, bison meat, animal hides, and berries. All of it passed through the hands of the Kitselas, and the Kitselas profited from it all. This was not a simple economic system. This was a complex and sophisticated trade network that had been in operation for thousands of years before any Europeans set foot on the west coast of Canada. These trade routes had their own name, the Grease Trails. The name comes from the commodity considered most precious in this trade system, eulachon oil. The eulachon is a small, not very meaty fish and has almost no culinary value in the conventional sense. But its body contains a special oil, and when rendered and pressed, that oil became one of the most important commodities in the indigenous trade system of the Pacific Northwest. The coastal peoples used eulachon oil to preserve food, for lighting, and to trade with the interior peoples. The interior peoples considered it a precious currency to exchange for goods from the coast. And the paths that the eulachon oil travelled, the routes running from the coast deep into the interior through canyons and valleys, were the Grease Trails. The Skeena River was one of the most important Grease Trails. What is astonishing is that when archaeologists looked for traces of this trade network, they discovered its true scale. Seashells from the Pacific coast have appeared in archaeological sites in the American Midwest. Jade from the mines found in New Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes region found along the Atlantic coast. These were not local networks. These were transcontinental trade corridors that had operated for thousands of years, and the Skeena River was a critical link in that network. The mouth of the Skeena River is not just where the river meets the sea. It was the intersection of 2 trade routes, the north-south trade along the coast and the east-west trade across the mountains into the interior. That intersection, the land that is now the city of Prince Rupert, was the territory of the coastal Tsimshian people, and they knew very well the value of the position they occupied. But then something came that changed everything. It was not the Europeans arriving in the 18th century. It was not the gold rush of the 19th century. The thing that truly changed everything in the Skeena Corridor was the steam locomotive. At the beginning of the 20th century, Canada was on the verge of an economic revolution. The western part of the country had enormous resources: timber, coal, grain, minerals. But to bring those resources to the world market, a railway was needed. And for the railway in Western Canada to connect to the Pacific, a port had to be found. By this time, Vancouver was already the main port of British Columbia, connected by the Canadian Pacific Railway since 1886. But Vancouver is in the south, and the route from Vancouver to ports in Japan or China was significantly longer than what could be achieved from a more northerly starting point. This is why Charles Melville Hayes, president of the Grand Trunk Railway Company, took an interest in a piece of wilderness in northern British Columbia in 1903. Hayes was no stranger to geography. He understood very well that on the great circle of the globe, the shortest path between North America and Asia is not a straight line on a flat map. It is a curve that arcs northward, very close to the Arctic Circle. And that meant the farther north the port, the shorter the distance to Asia. But Hayes couldn't simply choose any point in the north. The port needed water deep enough for large ships. It needed to be ice-free in the winter. And most importantly, it needed to be connected to the interior by a feasible railway line. When Hayes's engineers surveyed the northern coast of British Columbia, they found all of that in a single place, the Skeena River estuary. The water here is up to 35 meters deep, deeper than any other natural harbour in North America. The Pacific Ocean currents keep the port from ever freezing. And the Skeena River Valley, with its sufficient width and manageable gradient, provided the only viable route to build a railway through the coast mountains to the interior plateau. The European engineers of the 20th century discovered exactly what the Kitselas people had known for 5,000 years. This river was the only gateway. In 1906, construction of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway began. It was one of the most difficult construction projects in Canadian history. The workers, mostly Asian and European immigrants in harsh labour conditions, had to blast through granite cliffs, build bridges across deep canyons, and carve a rail along the Skeena's banks in places where there seemed to be no ground to stand on. At Kitselas Canyon, where the Kitselas people once collected tolls from traders, the engineers had to dig 4 tunnels in a span of less than 1 kilometre. This was the most difficult, most time-consuming, and most expensive section of the line. But there was no other way. This was geography, and it was non-negotiable. In 1912, while the railway was still under construction, Charles Melville Hayes boarded the RMS Titanic to return to Canada from a business trip in Europe. He never made it back. The Titanic sank in the Atlantic Ocean on the night of April 14th for 1912, and Hayes was among those who perished. 2 years later, in 1914, the railway he never lived to see completed was opened. The Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, running from Prince Rupert on the Pacific coast through the Skeena Valley into the Canadian interior, officially went into service. The man who had envisioned the railway never saw it run. But what he built has endured for more than 100 years since. However, there is one thing to understand about that railway. It did not arrive and change an empty land. It arrived and amplified what was already there. At the mouth of the Skeena River, even before the railway was completed, there were fish canneries. The North Pacific Cannery was built in 1889, 25 years before the railway arrived. Skeena River salmon, second only to the Fraser River in sockeye production, was an enormous economic resource long before the railway, and before those canneries there were 5,000 years of the Tsimshian people fishing, drying, preserving and trading salmon. This is what most historical accounts of this trade corridor miss. The railway did not create the trade corridor. Geography created the trade corridor. The railway was just the latest chapter in a 5,000-year-old story. After the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway went bankrupt due to massive construction costs, it was absorbed into Canada's national railway system in 1923 under the name Canadian National Railway. This is the company that still operates that railway today, although it was privatised in 1995. And when you look at the numbers for the Canadian National Railway today, you begin to understand why the story of the Skeena Corridor is so important in the 21st century. Every year, the Canadian National Railway moves over $184 billion worth of goods between North American and Asian markets. Over 300 million tonnes of cargo per year, and all of that cargo enters North America from Asia through the port of Prince Rupert, on docks built right where the Tsimshian once controlled the coastal trade route for thousands of years. But what makes this corridor truly significant in today's world is not just the railway or the port. It is its geographical position within the modern global trade network. Trade between Asia and North America is one of the largest economic flows in the world. Hundreds of billions of dollars in goods move across the Pacific Ocean each year, from factories in China, Japan, and South Korea to warehouses and retailers across North America. And to get those goods to consumers as quickly as possible, shipping companies must find the shortest and most efficient entry point into North America. This is where the geography of Prince Rupert becomes an inimitable advantage. On a Great Circle route, the distance from Shanghai to Prince Rupert is several sailing days shorter than the distance from Shanghai to Los Angeles or Seattle. Cargo ships do not travel in straight lines on a map. They follow the natural curvature of the globe, and that curve takes them across the North Pacific, very close to the northern coast of Canada. That means a ship from Shanghai reaches Prince Rupert days before it could reach Los Angeles. And cargo leaving Prince Rupert by train, reaching Chicago in 4 days, is still faster than cargo leaving from Los Angeles or Seattle for Chicago by rail. This is not the result of infrastructure investment or urban planning. This is geography. The Kitselas Canyon created a choke point 5,000 years ago. And now, that same geography, in a completely different way, is creating a competitive advantage for the 21st century. But this story is not entirely about economics and trade. There is another dimension, another layer to the story that cannot be ignored. The Kitselas were the customs agents of the ancient world. They controlled the passage through the canyon. They collected tolls, they grew wealthy from their geography, and then the railway came. When the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway built its line through Kitselas Canyon in the 1910s, it did what technology often does to geographical choke points. It eliminated it. Tunnels were blasted into the rock, bridges were built across treacherous stretches of the river, and the railway ran straight through the canyon that for millennia had been the Kitselas' instrument of power. The riverboat was no longer the only means of commerce. The steam locomotive didn't need to ask anyone for permission to pass. This is one of the core contradictions of modern economic history. Geography creates power, but technology can erase that power. The Kitselas had controlled the Skeena Corridor for 5,000 years based on a geographical advantage. And in just a few years, the steam locomotive and the steel rail erased that advantage. However, something endured through all that change. The oral traditions of the Kitselas, stories passed down for thousands of years, are the memory of an economy that once operated on entirely different principles. The story of the Salmon Prince, of the boy taken by the salmon into the world of underwater spirits, is not just a myth. It is an economic lesson encoded in artistic form. Resources are only lasting if they are harvested and managed sustainably. The Kitselas understood that thousands of years ago. The Skeena River doesn't produce salmon by chance, it produces salmon because the indigenous people managed that resource according to a system of knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. And when the railway came, when canneries began operating on an industrial scale, that system of knowledge was disregarded. The Skeena salmon still exist today, but their numbers are greatly diminished compared to a century ago. This is the second geographical paradox of this story. The very river that created the modern trade corridor is the same river that sustained a sustainable economy for 5,000 years. And those two economic systems are not entirely compatible. When the giant container ships from Shanghai dock at the port of Prince Rupert today, they arrive at a place the Tsimshian people once called the meeting point of all trade routes. They dock at the deepest natural harbour in North America. A harbour not man-made, but created by geology over millions of years. And their cargo travels inland up the Skeena River Valley along the very same path that indigenous traders travelled 5,000 years ago. It seems geography does not change. Only people and their tools change. In 2022, the Prince Rupert Port Authority began the largest expansion phase in its history, investing $3 billion Canadian to increase capacity and diversify cargo. The Fairview container terminal is being expanded. The rail infrastructure connecting the port to the national rail system is being upgraded. And future plans are even more ambitious. with a vision to make Prince Rupert one of the most important trade gateways on the entire Pacific coast. All of that is based on an unchangeable foundation, the geographical location of the mouth of the Skeena River. And while economists and planners are talking about a $3 billion investment and a 2030 vision, in Kitselas, not far away, the Kitselas people are raising a new totem pole. That totem pole, carved over 7 months by artist Stan Bevan and his apprentices, stands over 10 meters tall, the equivalent of a 3-story building. At the top of the pole is the figure of the Salmon Prince, returning to the salmon after what he learned in the spirit world. The story of the Salmon Prince is not a story of the past. It is a story about the price paid when a community forgets its relationship with the natural environment, and about what can happen when that is remembered. For centuries, the Kitselas controlled the Skeena Corridor, not just because they had military strength, but because they understood the river and what it required. That control wasn't just about collecting tolls, it was about stewardship, about responsibility. And now, as the global trade network turns to the Skeena Corridor once again, the question is perhaps not just how to move goods faster or cheaper. The question might be, what kind of knowledge, what system of stewardship can make this corridor sustainable for the next 5,000 years, just as it was for the last 5,000? But that is a story for the next chapter. Let's return to the original question. How did a small town of 12,300 people in a remote Canadian wilderness become one of North America's most important trade gateways? The answer is not because someone invested in the right place or because Canada's economic policies were better. The answer is simpler and more profound than that. Because this is the place where a river carved through a mountain range and created the only door. Because this is where the sea is deep enough for the world's largest ships to enter and exit. Because this is where, on the great circle of the globe, Asia and North America are closest. Geography created this place. The Tsimshian people understood that. 5,000 years ago, the Kitselas people built a small empire from it. Charles Melville Hayes saw it in 1903, and today, massive container ships from Shanghai and Tokyo follow the exact same path that the first Tsimshian dugout canoes travelled thousands of years ago. The terrain does not change, only the tools change. And that is why the Skeena Corridor, since humans first set foot here, has never lost its importance. Sometimes, the most important paths in history are not the ones that humans build. They are the paths that nature has already laid out, and humans were just smart enough to recognize them. The Skeena River is one such path, and its story, from 5,000 years ago to the day massive container ships dock at its mouth today, is living proof that of all the factors that shape human history, geography remains the least changed and therefore the most important.